My landlord refused to fix our heat in February when it was 12 degrees outside. Poor people should learn to dress warmer, he laughed when my baby got pneumonia. I called him 47 times begging for help. He blocked my number and raised my rent instead. What he didn't know was that I'm a city inspector with access to every building code violation in the city. 3 weeks later, I condemned his entire building empire and cost him $2.8 million. I never thought I'd be the type of person to completely destroy someone's livelihood. But when your landlord lets your infant daughter nearly die from cold exposure while laughing about it, all bets are off. Some people think what I did was excessive, but honestly, I don't care anymore. My name is Marcus Williams, I'm 31, and I work as a housing inspector for the city of Detroit. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and I genuinely believe in protecting people from slumlords and unsafe living conditions. The irony is that I ended up living in one of the worst situations I'd ever seen. 2 years ago, my wife Jennifer and I were looking for an apartment after our lease expired. We had a 6-month-old daughter, Kayla, and needed something affordable but safe. Detroit's rental market is tough when you're on a budget, and we were running out of time. That's when we found the listing for 1,247 Maple Street. It was a 2-bedroom apartment in an older building, managed by a company called Berkshire Property Management. The rent was $800 a month, which was at the top of our budget, but doable. The landlord was Richard Berkshire, a guy in his early 50s who owned about 15 rental properties throughout the city. He seemed professional enough during our initial meeting, well-dressed, drove a nice car, talked about maintaining his properties to high standards. I run a quality operation, he told us as we toured the apartment. I don't rent to just anyone. I'm looking for responsible tenants who will take care of the place. The apartment looked decent enough. It was clean, freshly painted, and seemed to have good heating and plumbing. The neighborhood wasn't the best, but it wasn't the worst either. We decided to take it. The problem started almost immediately after we moved in. First, the hot water heater began acting up. We'd have hot water for about 10 minutes before it turned ice cold. I called Richard to report the issue. Hot water heaters are temperamental, he said dismissively. Just don't take such long showers. When I explained that we had a baby who needed regular baths, he sighed like I was being unreasonable. I'll look into it when I have time, he said. These things aren't emergencies. A week later, nothing had been done. I called again. Mr. Berkshire, we really need this fixed. It's affecting our ability to properly care for our daughter. Look, Marcus, I'm not running a hotel here. You signed a lease for an apartment, not a luxury resort. If you wanted guaranteed hot water, you should have rented somewhere more expensive. That should have been my first red flag, but we'd already paid first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. We were financially committed. The hot water issue dragged on for 3 weeks before Richard finally sent someone to look at it. The repair guy he sent was clearly the cheapest option he could find, some guy with a pickup truck who took one look at the water heater and said it needed to be replaced. Instead of replacing it, Richard had the guy do some kind of temporary patch that lasted about 2 weeks before failing again. The second major issue was the plumbing. The bathroom sink would back up constantly, and the toilet would overflow at least once a week. Our downstairs neighbor complained that water was leaking through her ceiling. Again, Richard's response was dismissive. Old buildings have character, he said when I called to report the flooding toilet. You need to learn to live with minor inconveniences. Mr. Berkshire, sewage water flooding our bathroom isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a health hazard, especially with a baby in the house. Don't be dramatic. A little water never hurt anyone. But the real nightmare began in January when the heat stopped working. Detroit in January is brutal. We're talking about temperatures in the single digits, sometimes below zero. When the furnace died on a Tuesday night when it was 8 degrees outside, I called Richard immediately. Mr. Berkshire, our heat is completely out. It's freezing in here, and we have a baby. It's after hours, he said. I don't handle maintenance calls after 6 p.m. Call me tomorrow. This is an emergency. The apartment is getting dangerously cold. Use some blankets. People survived without central heating for thousands of years. He hung up on me. That night, Jennifer and I huddled in bed with Kayla between us. piling every blanket we owned on top of us. The temperature inside the apartment dropped to about 45 degrees. We could see our breath. I called Richard first thing the next morning. "I'll send someone to look at it," he said, sounding annoyed that I'd called. "When?" "When I can arrange it. These things take time. Mr. Berkshire, we have an infant. This isn't something that can wait. Look, I'm not going to drop everything and spend a fortune on emergency repair calls just because you're a little chilly. Wait your turn." That was Wednesday. By Thursday night, still no repair person had shown up. The apartment was now consistently below 40 degrees. We were running space heaters constantly, which was driving our electric bill through the roof and probably creating a fire hazard. Kayla was starting to show signs of being affected by the cold. She was crying more than usual, had trouble sleeping, and her little hands and feet were always ice cold, no matter how many layers we put on her. I called Richard again Friday morning. "Where is the repair person? You said you'd send someone." "I said I'd look into it. I'm working on it. It's been 3 days. The apartment is uninhabitable." "Don't be dramatic. If it was uninhabitable, you wouldn't still be living there. We don't have anywhere else to go. We have a lease and we've paid our rent. You have a legal obligation to provide heat. I have an obligation to make reasonable efforts to address maintenance issues. I'm working on it." "What reasonable efforts? You haven't done anything." "I don't appreciate your tone, Marcus. I'm trying to help you. But if you're going to be difficult about it, maybe you should consider finding somewhere else to live." That weekend was a nightmare. The temperature outside dropped to 12 degrees, and inside our apartment, it was barely 35 degrees. We were essentially living in a refrigerator. Sunday night, Kayla developed a fever. Her breathing seemed labored, and she was lethargic in a way that terrified us. We took her to the emergency room. Pneumonia. Our 6-month-old daughter had pneumonia from prolonged exposure to cold. The doctor was horrified when we explained our living situation. "You need to get that child out of that environment immediately," she said. "Continued exposure to those temperatures could be life-threatening for an infant." We ended up staying in a hotel that night, which we couldn't afford but had no choice about. Monday morning, I called Richard from the hospital, where Kayla was being treated. "Mr. Berkshire, my daughter is in the hospital with pneumonia because of the temperature in your apartment. When are you going to fix the heat?" "That's unfortunate," he said, with about as much emotion as if I'd told him it was raining. "But I can't be held responsible for every little sniffle your kid gets." "It's not a sniffle. She has pneumonia. The doctor said it was caused by cold exposure." Doctors say a lot of things. Kids get sick. It happens. Are you going to fix the heat or not? "I'm working on it. These things take time. Maybe you should dress your kid warmer." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did you just suggest that my infant daughter got pneumonia because we didn't dress her warmly enough in our 35-degree apartment? I'm just saying, poor people used to know how to stay warm without depending on landlords to coddle them. That's when something snapped inside me. Poor people? Is that what you think of your tenants? If the shoe fits, look, Marcus, I provide housing at a reasonable price. If you want luxury accommodations, pay luxury prices. Otherwise, learn to be grateful for what you have. I hung up and sat in that hospital room watching my baby daughter struggle to breathe, and I made a decision. Richard Berkshire was about to learn what happens when you mess with someone who knows exactly how the system works. See, as a city housing inspector, I have access to databases that most people don't even know exist. I can look up every property owned by a person or company, every complaint that's been filed, every violation that's been issued, and every permit that's been pulled. I also know every single building code in the book, and I know exactly how to apply them. That night, while Jennifer stayed with Kayla at the hospital, I went home to our freezing apartment and began doing research. What I found was disturbing, but not surprising. Richard Berkshire owned 23 properties throughout Detroit, not the 15 he'd claimed. He operated under several different company names to avoid having all the complaints and violations linked to one entity. But I was able to piece together the full picture, and it was ugly. Over the past 5 years, there have been 247 complaints filed against Richard's various properties. Heat issues, plumbing problems, electrical hazards, pest infestations, roof leaks, broken windows, you name it. Most of the complaints had been closed as resolved, without any real follow-up to confirm that repairs had actually been made. More importantly, I found patterns that suggested Richard was systematically targeting low-income tenants, single mothers, immigrants, and people with poor credit who couldn't easily move elsewhere. His strategy was simple: rent to vulnerable people, provide minimal maintenance, ignore complaints, and count on the fact that his tenants couldn't afford to move or fight back. It was predatory and it was probably illegal, but it was also brilliant in a sociopathic way. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He targeted someone who could fight back. The next morning, while Kayla was still in the hospital, I put in for a week of vacation time and began my investigation. First, I drove by every single property that Richard owned. What I found was exactly what I expected: a portfolio of deteriorating buildings with obvious code violations visible from the street. Broken railings, cracked foundations, boarded up windows that should have been replaced, fire escapes that were rusted through, electrical meters that were clearly not up to code. Any one of these properties would have been enough to generate multiple violations. Together, they represented a systematic pattern of negligent property management. But I wasn't going to rely on just visual inspections. I was going to go deeper. I started calling other tenants in Richard's buildings, identifying myself as a concerned neighbor who was having issues with the same landlord. The stories I heard were heartbreaking and infuriating. Maria Santos, a single mother in one of his buildings on the east side, had been without hot water for 6 months. When she complained, Richard told her that Mexican families use too much water anyway. James Mitchell, an elderly man on a fixed income, had been dealing with a roof leak that had destroyed most of his furniture. Richard's response was that old people should live in senior housing if they can't handle minor inconveniences. Denise Washington, a nurse working 2 jobs to support her 3 kids, had been dealing with a mouse infestation so bad that her children were afraid to sleep in their own beds. Richard told her that people in your neighborhood should be used to living with vermin. Every story was the same: Richard ignoring legitimate maintenance requests while making racist, classist, or otherwise degrading comments about his tenants. But here's the thing about being a housing inspector: I don't just know how to identify violations. I know how to document them properly, how to build cases that will hold up in court, and how to navigate the bureaucracy to make sure complaints don't get buried. Over the next week, I filed formal complaints with the city on behalf of myself and 12 other tenants whose situations I had documented. But I didn't stop there. I also contacted the State Attorney General's office to report what appeared to be a pattern of discriminatory housing practices. I reached out to the local health department about the multiple properties with sewage and pest issues. I called the fire department to report the buildings with inadequate fire escapes and potential electrical hazards. I contacted the IRS to report suspected tax fraud, since Richard was operating under multiple business names and probably wasn't reporting all his rental income. And then I started doing the official inspections. See, when a complaint is filed with the city, it triggers an automatic inspection. And as one of the senior inspectors in the department, I was able to volunteer to handle the inspections for Richard's properties. This wasn't personal vendettas or corruption. It was me doing my job exactly by the book, just more thoroughly than usual. The first property I inspected was our own building. What I found was a code enforcement officer's dream come true. The furnace that was supposed to heat our apartment wasn't just broken, it was a fire hazard. The heat exchanger was cracked, which meant it was potentially leaking carbon monoxide into the building. The electrical system was a nightmare. Overloaded circuits, ungrounded outlets, extension cords used as permanent wiring. It was a wonder the place hadn't burned down. The plumbing was even worse. The main sewer line was partially collapsed, which explained the constant backups and flooding. The roof leaked in at least 6 places, which had caused extensive water damage and mold growth in the walls. In total, I documented 47 separate code violations in our building alone. Any one of the major violations would have been enough to justify condemning the building as uninhabitable. I issued a formal notice giving Richard 30 days to address the violations or face fines and potential criminal charges. His response was exactly what I expected. He called me furious. "Marcus, what the hell do you think you're doing? This is harassment." "I'm doing my job, Mr. Berkshire. Your building has serious safety violations that put tenants at risk. This is payback because I wouldn't fix your heat fast enough." The heat is just one of many issues. Your building has a cracked furnace that's leaking carbon monoxide. That's a life-threatening situation. You can't do this. I'll sue you for harassment. You're welcome to file a complaint with my supervisor. But these violations are real, they're documented, and they need to be fixed. I'm not spending $50,000 on repairs because you're having a tantrum. Then you'll face the fines and legal consequences. Your choice. He hung up on me, but not before calling me several names that I won't repeat here. Over the next 2 weeks, I conducted formal inspections of 8 more of Richard's properties. The results were consistently appalling. Building after building with serious safety violations, health hazards, and code violations that had clearly been ignored for years. In total, I documented over 300 separate violations across Richard's portfolio. The estimated cost to bring all the buildings up to code was approximately $400. The fines for failing to address the violations would be about $150. But I still wasn't done. Remember, Richard had made racist and discriminatory comments to multiple tenants. That gave me grounds to involve the federal government. I filed a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, alleging systematic discrimination in housing based on race, ethnicity, and economic status. I also contacted a civil rights attorney who specialized in housing discrimination cases. The attorney, Sandra Mitchell, was very interested in Richard's case. This is exactly the kind of systematic discrimination that fair housing laws were designed to prevent, she told me. If you can document the pattern of discriminatory comments and treatment, we can build a strong case. I have statements from 12 tenants detailing discriminatory comments and treatment. I also have documentation showing that he targets vulnerable populations and provides substandard housing. That's perfect. We can file both civil and criminal complaints. Within a month, Richard was facing over 300 building code violations, with fines totaling $150. A federal housing discrimination investigation, a civil lawsuit representing 23 tenants seeking damages, state attorney general investigation for fraudulent business practices, IRS audit for potential tax fraud, multiple properties condemned as uninhabitable. But the real blow came when the city decided to make an example of him. The mayor had been under pressure to crack down on slumlords, and Richard's case provided the perfect opportunity for a high-profile enforcement action. At a press conference, the mayor announced that the city was taking aggressive action against predatory landlords who exploit vulnerable tenants while maintaining dangerous and substandard housing. Richard's name and photo were plastered across local news coverage. The story was picked up by investigative reporters who dug even deeper into his business practices. They found that Richard had been using fake names and shell companies to hide the extent of his property empire. They discovered that he'd been evicting tenants who complained about conditions. They uncovered evidence that he'd been discriminating against tenants based on race and immigration status. The coverage was devastating for his business. Banks began calling in loans on his properties. Insurance companies canceled policies on buildings with extensive code violations. The few tenants who could afford to move elsewhere started leaving. But the most satisfying moment came when Richard called me, desperate. "Marcus, you've got to call off this witch hunt. You're destroying my business over a stupid heating issue." It was never about the heat, Richard. It was about the way you treated my daughter, the way you treated all your tenants, and the way you've been running dangerous buildings while insulting people who had no choice but to live in them. Look, I'll fix everything. The heat, the plumbing, whatever you want. Just stop this campaign against me. It's too late for that. You had your chance to be a decent human being, and you chose to be a predator instead. You're ruining me over nothing, so your kid got a little cold. Kids get sick all the time. My daughter nearly died because you were too cheap and too cruel to fix a broken furnace. And then you laughed about it and told me that poor people should learn to dress warmer. I didn't mean it like that. Yes, you did. And now you get to face the consequences. The final blow came 6 months later when the civil lawsuit was settled. 23 tenants, representing years of discriminatory treatment and substandard housing conditions, were awarded a total of $2.8 million in damages. Richard's insurance covered some of it, but he was personally liable for over $1.5 million. Combined with the cost of bringing his buildings up to code, the fines, and the legal fees, Richard was forced to sell most of his properties at a loss. The buildings were purchased by a nonprofit housing organization that specialized in providing quality, affordable housing. They spent over $800,000 renovating the properties and turning them into decent places for people to live. As for us, we moved out of Richard's building as soon as Kayla was released from the hospital. We used our portion of the lawsuit settlement to buy a small house in a better neighborhood. Kayla is now 2 years old, healthy and happy. The pneumonia didn't cause any lasting damage, but it was touch and go for a while. The experience changed how I approach my job as a housing inspector. I'm more aggressive about following up on violations, more willing to pursue the maximum penalties, and more focused on protecting tenants from predatory landlords. I've also become an advocate for stronger tenant protection laws and better enforcement of existing housing codes. But the most important lesson I learned was that sometimes you have to be willing to use every tool at your disposal to protect the people you love. Richard thought he could treat his tenants like garbage because they were poor, vulnerable, and had no other options. He was wrong about me having no other options. I had knowledge, I had access to the system, and I had the determination to use both to destroy anyone who threatened my family. Richard lost his business, his reputation, and most of his wealth because he was too arrogant to treat people with basic human decency. He could have fixed our heat for a few $100s. Instead, his cruelty cost him nearly $3 million and his entire livelihood. Sometimes karma needs a little help from someone who knows how to work the system. A few months ago, I saw Richard working as a cashier at a discount grocery store. He looked older, tired, and defeated. Part of me felt a moment of sympathy for him. Then I remembered my daughter struggling to breathe in that hospital bed, and the sympathy disappeared. He made his choices. I just made sure he faced the consequences. These days, I get calls from tenants all over the city who are dealing with slumlords. I help them document violations, file complaints, and navigate the system to get the help they need. It's become a passion project for me, using my knowledge and position to protect people who are being exploited by predators like Richard. I've helped get 12 other landlords prosecuted for code violations and discriminatory practices. I've helped dozens of families get out of dangerous housing situations and get the compensation they deserved. Richard Berkshire taught me that some people will only understand consequences when those consequences are severe enough to destroy them. He wanted to play hardball with a baby's life. So I played hardball with his entire existence. And I sleep just fine at night knowing that dozens of families now live in safe, decent housing because I was willing to use every weapon at my disposal to take down a predator. Justice isn't always pretty, but sometimes it's exactly what the situation requires.